Cowboys Overtime. It is that time here on StarTelegram.com, sponsored by Window Nation. I am Fort Worth Star Telegram columnist, award-losing columnist, Mac Engel. The man on the other side of your screen is Cowboys know-it-all, our Cowboys beat man, Mr. Nick Harris. Nick, you look like you're in a prison.
Yeah, give or take. It's one of
or
the
or is it a toilet?
It's like one of the podcast rooms here at the Star. So
okay,
it's just you pop in here, you do your little segment, and then you get out, and hopefully it doesn't echo too bad.
All right, how have you been?
Been good. It's been an interesting week here at the Star. Obviously, kind of tracking how the team is feeling coming off of a demoralizing loss. I don't think there's any other way to put it, but there's some confidence around the building because it is still only week 2, or now we're getting into week 3. But we'll dive into it.
So, Nick, how many times when you use the word interesting, is it good?
50-50. I would say 50-50.
Okay. It's one of those flexible words, right? It's like the word
absolutely.
Fine. Okay. All right. Let's get right into it. Were we fooled? Cowboys in week 1 dominate the Cleveland Browns in Cleveland. They come back home in week 2, and they look absolutely awful.
Yeah.
And a loss not to Tom Brady's New England Patriots or the 85 Bears, but Derek Carr and the New Orleans Saints and running back Alvin Kamara. I didn't even know he was still in the league, and he scores 5 touchdowns. 4 or 5?
4.
4. Sorry, I threw in another one.
I know. Once you get past 3, it's just like he's got one.
Who cares? I was fooled. I was totally fooled, and it wasn't because I thought the Cowboys were so great. I didn't think the Saints were capable of that in consecutive weeks. Nick, you thought the Cowboys would win, but not cover the 6.5-point spread. Because I'm an eternal optimist, I thought they would do both. Instead, right. They got killed. Were we fooled?
I was fooled from a defensive perspective. I don't think I was necessarily fooled from an offensive perspective because there were some things we saw in that game on the offensive side of the ball that you expected. There was miscommunication between Dak and CD. It was evident on a touchdown throw where they both thought they were going 2 different directions. Yeah. Ball ended up over here. CD ended up over here. It happened another time in the second half. And then, as I've mentioned over and over again, and as we'll dive into later, the running game is non-existent. So, there were things in the offensive game plan or that the offensive team executed that I kind of saw coming. But from a defensive perspective, I would say I was fooled. I really thought that the product that they had with all 11 players on the field was better than what we saw. It started up front. I mean, those interior defensive linemen got absolutely blown off the ball. Pro Football Focus does a really good job grading individual players from each week, each team, each game. And 3 of the 4 worst interior defensive linemen in the entire NFL last week came from the Dallas Cowboys. And really, really tough. And when one of those is not Mozzie Smith, you look at that as almost like an optimism point. You're like, okay, hey, the second-year guy who's done nothing but not reach expectations in the time he's been here was not one of the bad guys mentioned, but his grade was still really poor. Then you look at the second level. I think there was a lot of times that the linebackers were asked to do 3 things at once, 2 things at once. I mean, you can look back at it on film. Guys are getting blown off the line on the defensive line, and linebackers are having to play 2 gaps at the same time. And then somehow Alvin Kamara just kind of splits around and then comes back in as one person on the other side and scores a touchdown. It was just a really tough effort. And then you look at the secondary. Now, while the corners, they did have some moments, you look at the safeties getting split right down by Rashid Shaheed on the 70-yard touchdown. Really bad work. Trayvon Diggs got beat on a couple of Rashid Shaheed routes too. I'm not saying that the corners played perfectly, but it was an all-around poor effort by the defensive side of the ball. I just thought a Mike Zimmer coached team with that much veteran experience, with that many Pro Bowlers, would prepare for a game like that a little bit better. But I was fooled for sure.
I think the part that fooled me was, and after the game, I had asked Mike McCarthy. And I think I phrased my question somewhere along the lines of, you were so good in week 1 and then really not in week 2. And he said, I don't think we really played that one in week 1. And if you look at it offensively, they really didn't. They did okay. They did more than enough to win, given how their defense played. So really, you can make an argument the offense really hasn't looked that great in 2 straight weeks. And they got away with it because they made enough plays in Cleveland. Whereas they were going to have to carry all the water in week 2, and instead all they did was spill it. Speaking of the offense, after the game, one of the points of conversation obviously was just how similar this loss to the Saints looked like their season-ending loss in the playoffs in January against Green Bay, where they were blown out again at home, having given up more than 40 points in those 2 losses. So I asked Dak Prescott about it. We're going to draw that conclusion, and he said no. You're going down the wrong hole on that one to draw any comparisons. They're totally different. And his point was, you got different tackles and different linemen and different players. And I understand his point, but in my mind, I'm like, I'm sorry, you're in denial. These were the same games. And you mentioned it. You mentioned when we were sitting together watching the game. It's the same thing. It's the same thing against San Francisco. It's the same thing against Green Bay. These are the same offenses, and they're not that complicated. But when they're well run, they have torn them apart. Is Dak in denial that these games were basically the same?
I understand what he's saying, and basically saying that the impact of these losses are not the same. Like from a mentality standpoint,
totally different.
Yeah. They probably are different, and that's probably what he meant in retrospect. But when you look at the dichotomy of how both of these losses happen, you break down the structure of it, it's the exact same. You get run off the ball defensively. Physicality just overwhelmed you in the trenches on both sides of the ball. And then offense could never find a rhythm. And then they start pressing in the second half, and it leads to turnovers. We saw that in San Francisco last year.
Yeah.
We saw that in Buffalo last year. We saw that in Miami last year. We see it in the Green Bay loss in the playoffs, and then you see it in New Orleans. And when you look at all 5 of those having common themes, yeah, you got to look back and you got to be able to draw those comparisons. And I think just to be able to identify that on film and identify similar things that led to those losses last year, and even though you have different personnel on defense and you have a different defensive coordinator, the same thing still happening, then you got to kind of look around and see what the issue is from a culture standpoint.
Well, you mentioned a couple of those games, and it's certainly worth mentioning that when you look at this team last season and this season, when they have lost, and they really haven't lost that much. They've lost 6 regular season games, and then obviously the playoff losses. But, I mean, some of these losses, when they lose, they get destroyed. The game in San Francisco last year, the game in Buffalo last year. The Miami game was close, obviously. The Green Bay game in the playoffs, this Saints game. Isn't it a little baffling to you how a team can win 12 games in a regular season and open in Cleveland, be capable of all of those wins, and then capable of not just losing by, it's 1 score, it's 6, it's 5, that's a typical NFL loss, but getting their rear ends handed to them by 20-plus points. That's baffling to me.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I don't think anybody saw that coming. I think if you had even asked, some players in New Orleans last week, and they were asked, and they were like, this is going to be a hard-fought game. We're going to have to really show up in the fourth quarter. They didn't have to show up in the fourth quarter. They could have rolled out a JV team if they had one. And this is a team that was coming off a really tough week of practice with Hurricane Francine hitting Louisiana. Yeah. They had to leave practice early one day. They had to show up late another day. So they were all out of sorts throughout the week, and it didn't matter. They walked into AT&T Stadium and handed a 25-point loss to the Dallas Cowboys. So, is New Orleans improved, and is there probably some truth in the sense that, teams are still adjusting to the Clint Kubiak offense? Absolutely. But you shouldn't get beat in that manner with those offensive weapons and your defensive weapons. You shouldn't get beat in that manner on your home field.
No way. I mean, The part that's so dispiriting about it, you can get a loss. You understand. I mean, the first season, Nick, the first month of a regular season is kind of a mess because that's basically your preseason now. So it's going to be a little bit uneven. We're seeing that in Cincinnati. We're seeing that certainly in Baltimore, the Cowboys' next opponent, other cities too. I get that, but it's incredible to me how they made that Saints team and that quarterback, he completed 11 balls for 250 yards. I mean, it's just you don't even think it's possible given the fact that this team has won 12 regular season games and been consistently a good winner. Okay, let's go into one more topic before we go to break, and that is a topic that you've talked about a lot. You wrote about in the Star Telegram. It's a good piece. Basically, this running game has absolutely no identity, and one of the players said it. I think it was Deuce Vaughn said it to you. Jerry Jones on his radio show this week on on 105 through the fan indicated that elevating Dalvin Cook in the practice squad does not look like it's going to happen anytime soon. Nick, we knew it was going to be one of those things that we have to kind of 2 games in. There is nothing I've seen that gives me pause to think that they did anything other than really, really screw up this position.
Yeah, I think if you look at the running back position as a whole, you look at what they could have done this offseason to address it. We could start with the draft and all of the talented backs that were there in day 2 and even into day 3 that they could have gone out there and grabbed, or they maybe could have traded up and grabbed. When they picked in the 3rd round, granted, they did pick a guy in Cooper Beebe that they needed there up front, a good pick at the end of the day. They still had that 2nd, 3rd round pick. There were running backs on the board there that could have played and been contributors, and we're already seeing those guys contribute for their respective teams that they were drafted to so far here early in the season. You throw the draft away. Let's say that, Jerry Jones looked at the running back board and the front office looked at the running back board and said, you know what, none of these guys inspire confidence. Let's go to the free agent market. They go in and get Ezekiel Elliott instead of a guy like J.K. Dobbins, who's really starting to perform for the Chargers so far this year on a very similar contract deal, because the Cowboys were dealing with limited money from their standpoint. And so if they were dealing with that kind of change, they could have gotten a J.K. Dobbins instead of an Ezekiel Elliott. And what we've seen from Ezekiel Elliott is 16 carries and 56 yards in 2 games. I don't think that's what anybody would want or expect looking up in week 2. And you asked Jerry Jones about the running back situation. He was asked again this morning on 105 through the fan, and he said that the only people asking him about the running back problem is the media. And so it's an interesting situation. That's a bad interesting situation that we're dealing with the running back situation, just because I don't see it being addressed moving forward. They have a guy on the practice squad in Dalvin Cook who could bring some juice. But how long before it is too long to wait to elevate him or to bring in another body?
You mentioned its numbers and that they didn't expect it. I don't know how they couldn't expect it. I mean, it's what he did his last season in Dallas 2 years ago. It's what he did in New England last season. I'm in for 10 yards, basically the 10-yard line and in. That's why he's here. Is to score those touchdowns on short yardage run. That's why he's here. That's it. So this idea that to be something even remotely close to what he was 3 years ago, that's just stupid personnel decisions. Okay, we've got more to talk about here on Cowboys Overtime, but first, let's hear from our good friends at Window Nation.
Window Nation, the star of window replacement and proud partner of the Dallas Cowboys, can help you fill the house this season with savings. Buy 2 windows, get 2 free, and make no interest payments for 60 months, 5 full years. Fill your house for a customized authentic Dallas Cowboys jersey while supplies last. You could even help fill the Cowboys house and win tickets to a game. Visit windownation.com/Cowboys now for details. Call 866-95-NATION. Window Nation, proud partner of the Dallas Cowboys.
Thank you very much, Window Nation. Thank you for joining us here on SportTelegram.com for Cowboys Overtime. I'm Mac Engel. He's Nick Harris. Nick, I'm sorry. I'm this close to calling you Clarence. I'll get over this.
We'll get there.
Week 1, the Cowboys go to Cleveland. Let's just give it a couple more months. Nick, Cowboys in week 1 look great. Go to Cleveland, dominate the Browns, a team that we thought, should look a hell of a lot better than that. Week 2, get the butts kicked at home against the Saints. So, which one of the 2 do you think are the real Dallas Cowboys? Week 1 or week 2?
I think it falls somewhere in the middle. I think if you look at the performance that they had against the Browns, specifically in the first half, how they were able to fire on all cylinders on all 3 phases. And then in the second half, you start to see some of the offensive issues. And then definitely in the Saints game, you see these defensive issues super amplified. I think it falls somewhere in the middle, because that was the first time that I felt like the Cowboys defense was really tested. I don't feel like the Browns really tested them. They're going to get another test here this week. How has this week's practice and learning and film sessions, how will that application process work on Sunday? I think you're going to find a conclusion that's probably somewhere in the middle of where they played in week 1 and week 2. I don't have a ton of confidence in the defense going into week 3, just given the nature of how they have lost games in the last 2 years. compared with the nature of how Baltimore has won games over the course of the last 2 years. And the Cowboys offensively, there's still some things that they have to work out. Is Jake Ferguson going to be super healthy when he does touch the field on Sunday? Can he be healthy enough to be a passing weapon? Is CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott's connection getting better? Is there a running game that can at least show signs of life? There's a lot of questions that still need to be answered, but probably somewhere in the middle. That's my answer.
I think you're right. I think there's a couple things that we've seen in week 1 and week 2 are troubling. Certainly the injury to Jake Ferguson is significant because it exposes that this team just is bereft of real weapons after CeeDee Lamb and Jake Ferguson. Kevontae Turpin, he's too small. There's only so many things you can do with him. The running game is, mid at best. The young receivers haven't done anything to establish themselves other than the occasional occasional catch here or there, but they're not a threat yet. They're not people that opposing defenses have to really mark and track the minute they come out of the huddle. And I think those things are a big concern, but man, you just touched on it. To me, the biggest concern is that front seven and how, obviously DeMarvin and Overshawn looked so good in week 1. I mean, looked great. And then they barely used him in week 2. Eric Hendricks was a guy who looked really solid in week 1. In week 2, he looked like a guy who was done. And I understand we're going to have some pendulum swings. That's the nature of the NFL. But the other thing, too, is, as bad as the interior of that defensive line was, the defensive ends weren't that much better. I mean, they ran right at Micah Parsons. And, it kind of negated his ability as a pass rusher. So, and I realize, like I said, there's a pendulum effect going, but, the defensive line thing to me, because there's an element to our scale of 1 to 10, Nick, how big are these defensive line issues? A 10, 5, 2? It's got to be more than a 5.
Yeah, I would put it at a 6. You look at the interior defensive line, and there is no confidence there. But you look at the ends, and you have a guy in Micah Parsons who, through 3 seasons in the league, has been a 3-time All-Pro. And then you also have DeMarcus Lawrence on the other side, who's a seasoned veteran. Now, he did not look great against the Saints, but he looked good against the Browns, and he was your best run defender from a year ago on that defensive line. So you got to be able to trust that veteran moving forward. I like those 2 ends, but I think when you look at the defensive line as a whole, that interior defensive line is only growing with problems. I mean, you have Jordan Phillips, who goes on the IR earlier this week with a wrist injury. You got Mozzie Smith, who's been battling a back injury going into the week. It's tough.
So you mentioned Jordan Phillips. I'm glad you mentioned him. Jordan Phillips goes on IR with a wrist injury, so he'll be out for 4 weeks. I have a bug in here. I don't know how he got in here. So Jordan Phillips was a late offseason acquisition. And the Cowboys say he has a wrist injury. Jordan Phillips says, no, I don't have a wrist injury. They put him on IR, so he's gone for 4 weeks, and they elevate Carlos Watkins from the practice squad. He had been in Washington. Is this an upgrade, or are we trading, an old car for an old beat-up car?
Yeah, I think it's probably somewhere near the latter. Jerry Jones was asked this morning about the Jordan Phillips situation. He said he, in my mind, is favoring his wrist. That is a fact. So, in my mind, that's a fact.
What do you think?
I do believe that there are some issues that he is having with his wrist going back to December of 2023. Coincidentally enough, he hurt that wrist against the Dallas Cowboys when he was playing for the Bills last year, had to have surgery on it. And from people I've talked to, it sounds like that he's not using that wrist to 100% capabilities. And then when that was communicated to him, there was maybe a little bit of pushback on there. But they're using these 4 weeks to do testing, rehab that wrist, get it back to 100%, and then hopefully be able to bring him back after the bye week with an understanding that he can use both wrists to full capabilities. But, that's what's been communicated to me, and it's definitely another bad, interesting situation that has arisen this week.
So you mentioned DeMarcus Lawrence, and there's one development about this defense that I think all of us have – I don't want to say ignored, but because we like the guy so much, but Tank's not a young guy anymore. And, he looks really, really good. You mentioned it in week 1, and he's been, consistently one of the best defensive players against the run at his position, not just for the Cowboys, but at his position. Yeah. Are you concerned at all? I am. I am concerned that we're looking at a guy who's right at the doorknob or right at the doorstep of getting old, and you never know what's going to happen. It just happens. Do you think we're there with Tank?
I don't think so, actually. I think when you look back at what he did in 2023, you look at the film that he produced. Like I said, I think he was the Cowboys' best run defender last year. Now, given they didn't have any linebackers and they didn't have any safeties that were willing to step up and make some plays in the run game, Jaron Kearse certainly didn't help to that effect. But DeMarcus Lawrence saved a lot of situations in games last year that probably would have ended up in much more tumultuous situations. I mean, he was a Pro Bowler a year ago. He was a Pro Bowler the year before that. He's on the last year of his contract. I think he's a guy. If I were making decisions in the front office, I'd put out a 2-year deal for him on his table to bring him back and get him back at least for 2 more years and help to kind of nurture Marshawn Nealand along.
Interesting take. Yeah, because that clearly, that's his replacement, and he knows it. And Marshawn's not going to be ready to be anything other than a spot player this year. Okay, we've got one more thing to talk about, and that is prediction time. Dallas Cowboys host the Baltimore Ravens on Sunday at AT&T Stadium. It's at 3:30, and one of the bigger surprises of the NFL season so far is that the Ravens, who had home field advantage throughout the AFC playoffs last season, are 0-2, even with a healthy Lamar Jackson. They've got Derrick Henry. They signed him in the offseason, a running back that I know a lot of Cowboys tried with the idea that maybe their team would sign him. But, hey, no, they had Rico Dowdle, so it's all good. Baltimore, this line has moved quite a bit. And Baltimore now is a 1-point – did I read that right? Baltimore is a 1-point favorite. Last week you were – now I'm 0-2. I'm 0-2 this season, Cowboys against the spread, which is how real men. And you're now 1-0 with us because you started a week after the weekend of the regular season. So Baltimore's a 1 favorite at AT&T Stadium. What you got?
Yeah, Baltimore, they cover that spread. They win this game. I think they win it by 2 scores. I think it is going to be a high-scoring affair, but until I can see the Dallas Cowboys stop a physically gifted team that can run the ball, I'm never going to pick them. And until I can see that with my own eyes, I'm not going to believe it.
I want to pick the Cowboys because I do, and I can't. I agree with you on this one. Baltimore wins. I don't know if it'll be a 2-score game. Boy, if it's a 2-score game, there's going to be hell to pay around the Star in Frisco next week. But until that day, let's keep all of our options open. Nick, thanks for your time. It's always nice to chat with you. For all of your Cowboys coverage needs, be sure to check them out on StarTelegram.com. Sunday afternoon, 3:30 p.m., Cowboys host the Ravens. We will be here to talk about it next week on Cowboys Overtime, sponsored by Window Nation. Thank you very much. See you next week.